Yep.
Okay, we'll go ahead and give it a start. Good morning, I'm Bob Bach with WUWM News. This is a special broadcast from WUWM Milwaukee Public Radio. It is the second of two forums with the candidates for governor of the state of Wisconsin. Yesterday we featured a conversation with Democrat Tom Barrett. Today we hear from Republican Scott Walker. Our forum is sponsored by the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee and WisPolitics.com. And members of our audience can participate in the forum. If you have a question, write it down on one of the index cards that have been distributed or will be, and pass that along. Someone will come by to collect them. We'll work in as many as we can throughout the broadcast. I do have some questions of my own, and then we'll go to the audience questions. Quick note that today's forum is being taped for broadcast this morning on Lake Effect. That's starting at 10 o'clock this morning on 89.7 WUWM. The forum is also being taped for broadcast by the Wisconsin Eye Network. Now, our guest today is Scott Walker, the Republican nominee for governor. Good morning.
Good morning.
Scott grew up and graduated from high school in Delavan, Wisconsin. He and his wife, Tanette, and two sons live in Wauwatosa. He was elected Milwaukee, first elected state representative in 1993, re-elected 4 times, and elected Milwaukee County Executive in 2002. Let's welcome Scott Walker. Yesterday, Scott, Mitch Teich from Lake Effect was in this chair with Tom Barrett in the chair that you're occupying, and I want to make sure that I re-ask some of the same questions that Tom was asked. So let me first invite an opening statement from you.
Sure. Well, I'm running for governor because I love this state, and I believe in Wisconsin. But I believe the governor we have right now is taking the state in the wrong direction, and I think it's about time we stand up and take our government back. For me, it's real simple. You look at the course we've charted for the past 8 years, I don't think it's worked. I don't think the economy is better in this state than it was 8 years ago. And I think that's really the question voters need to ask themselves come November 2nd, because even though it's a different person running, in the end, Tom Barrett, the mayor of Milwaukee, represents the third term of Jim Dole's policies. If people are satisfied with where the state's at, if they think we're better today than we were 8 years ago, then bluntly they should vote for the mayor of Milwaukee, Tom Barrett. But if you're like me, and I think the majority of people in the state, and you'd like to have us chart a new course, a better direction for the state, one that focuses about getting government out of the way and allowing our employers, particularly our small businesses, to be able to engage in creating more jobs in the state, then I invite you to join our movement. That's what it's really all about. In the end, we've got a plan to help create 250,000 new jobs. We've laid it out on our website, scottwalker.org, and I'd love to talk about that a little bit more here this morning.
Well, let me give you an opportunity to maybe get into some specifics about what it is that you would do better as governor of the state.
Well, really, if you look at the states in the past couple of years that have been successful, they're states that have gotten the cost of business down so that more businesses in those states, as well as those coming in those states, have been able to create more jobs. In our case, it's 6 simple things. I would cut the tax burden in the state. Cut the tax burden across the board, particularly on small businesses, on employers, on individuals. Help cap off property taxes, even do things as simple as phase out the state tax and retirement income. Because when we talk about new venture capital, starting up businesses or expanding existing businesses, one of the challenges we have in the state is too much of that wealth is sitting in other states creating jobs outside of Wisconsin. I want to keep more of that here. Secondly, I'd cut through the red tape. I talk about regulations in this state, again, particularly for small businesses. Some of their biggest challenges are the regulatory issues. There's the piles of paperwork that many of our small businesses have to deal with. I'd like to narrow that. I'd like to have the few regulations we have be science-based and predictable, be about things like public safety and public health. But for many of our small businesses, they complain that it goes far beyond that. They'd like to have some help there. Third, I'd like to eat through the high cost of litigation in the state, tackle the lawsuit abuse in the state. If you look across the country at the states that have seen economic growth, even over the past 2 years in these tough economic times, they're the states that have lowered the cost of business, and typically that means lower taxes for small businesses, that means fewer regulations, and that means true tort reform. On top of that, 3 others. I want to continue to improve our workforce, and one of the great things we have in this state is a well-trained, well-prepared, well-educated workforce, but we can't just be satisfied with the status quo. For me, that means improving our education system. As you mentioned, I have 2 sons. In fact, this morning they're headed off to Wauwatosa East High School. They get a great education there, just like I grew up going to a public school in Delavan at Delavan High School. But we can't just be satisfied with the status quo. We need to continually improve our education system. You know, whether it's in a public setting for the majority of our kids, some kids going to private schools, and even some in homeschool environments, we need to make sure that every kid in this state has access to a great education system. And that's really not only a moral imperative, it's an economic imperative. We want to continue to compete globally. One of the things I'd like to do is continue to reward excellence. If you're a great teacher, we want to compensate you for that. If you're not living up to that standard, we want to mentor and help you. And quite frankly, if you continue not to be able to live up to those standards, then we should allow local school districts to replace those teachers with people who can live up to those standards. Everywhere else in life, we pay for performance. I think it's about time we do in education. Besides education, two other quick ones. I think we need to tackle health care, but not the way they're talking about in Washington. In Washington, they talk about access and quality, but to get there, they talk about more and more government mandates from the federal government. I look at Wisconsin and say on nearly every ranking, we're about at the top of the list when it comes to access and quality. What's killing us in this state is the cost of providing access to quality health care. And as governor, I believe part of how you do that, you tackle that particularly for small businesses, is by getting government out of the way, or at least reducing the role of government. Things like eliminating the state tax and health savings accounts. Things like true disclosure and transparency. So any of us as purchasers of health care know what those real costs are when we're making decisions about our health care. Basically things that allow all of us, myself included, to get more skin in the game, so we're not just concentrating on health care cost, but ultimately about the quality of our health and making sure our health improves. And the third, or the fifth, well, I'm going to get my numbers right. The sixth thing, that was the fifth. The sixth thing is ultimately about a strong infrastructure system. That means cost-effective and reliable sources of power. It means clean water all throughout the state. It means telecommunications, so every part of the state can participate in really being a part of the global economy. And it means a great infrastructure system when it comes to transportation. We need to fix our roads and our bridges. Over the past several budgets prior to this one, this governor has rated about $1.3 billion out of the state transportation fund. We need to restore that and fix that infrastructure that really is a vital part of the state's economy. Now, overall, I believe doing those things, we can help the people of this state, not the government, the people of this state create 250,000 new jobs by the end of our term. That's 250,000 jobs by 2015. And to me, that's a simple but yet a comprehensive plan to get the state working again.
Let me ask you the very first thing that whomever is the new governor is going to face is a massive deficit. Yeah. The latest estimate yesterday, up to $3.1 billion. I think the accepted level is at $2.7 billion, but needless to say, it's an enormous amount of money. How will you try to eat away at that deficit, and what specific steps do you think you could take to get the books to balance?
Well, first off, you start out with a principle that I use governing right now, which is don't spend money you don't have. And unfortunately, for many years now, state government's gone down that path of spending money they didn't have. In our case, one of the things I look to is what I've done at the county level. And this year, next Thursday, a week from today, I'm going to introduce the 9th consecutive budget I've done without raising the property tax levy from the previous year. In fact, this year, because times are tough, I see too many of my neighbors with for sale signs. I've seen too many businesses going through foreclosure. So we need to do more than just hold the line. We're actually cutting the property tax levy by $1 million. It's kind of interesting reading the morning newspaper and seeing that for the first time ever, Mayor Barrett has actually proposed a budget that didn't raise the tax levy. A year ago, he kind of belittled me, saying anybody can propose a budget without a tax levy increase. Well, he didn't do that for the last 6 budgets. He's now doing an election year. I think it's kind of interesting timing. But in our case, the reason I point out to that is we're introducing a budget with $1 million property tax levy cut. We're still maintaining our core functions in terms of public safety, public health, basic safety net programs, transportation, other issues down the line, but we're balancing our budget. And part of it is, as we proposed in the past through wage and benefit reforms, that not only help balance the current budget, but future budgets. The state, we need to do exactly the same thing. This governor and many in the legislature for years have kicked the can into the future, which is precisely why we're facing the kind of budgetary problems not only for this coming budget, but why it continues to grow, why there's that so-called structural deficit out there. I've got a couple things I've already lined out and many more in the future. One simple example of the reforms we've talked about is right now, other than a handful of state employees, the vast majority of all the rest of state workers don't pay anything for the pension system. You go outside of government, most businesses have 401ks or similar type retirement systems. So for those who have pensions, the employee pays the employee contribution, the employer pays the employer contribution, not in state government. To me, I propose simply having all state workers, including me, pay the portion of the employee contribution. In fact, I'll not only wait for the budget, I'll start making that on day one. On the day I take office, I'll start making the employee contribution as governor. Just like years ago, if you remember, When I first came into office, the county executive was literally making more money than the governor. I thought that was wrong, and over the last 8 years, Tonette and I have given back roughly $370,000 of our own personal salary. You've got to lead by leadership. You've got to lead by personal leadership, not just rhetoric out there. In our case, the pension contribution alone would save $360 million in the next budget. On top of that, you look at another example we've laid out there. There are 4,000 vacant positions in state government today that don't involve public safety. Positions that don't have a person in them, but positions that are literally, they're vacant, but the funding is still in those state agencies. We've already got by more than a year without filling those positions. By next year, when the budget's enacted, that'll be 2 years without filling those. To me, if those duties have been reassigned, we should allow, in our next budget, not just allow, we'll eliminate those positions permanently. Those two things combined save over $1 billion. You start adding other things. We've got a Waste, Fraud, and Abuse Commission that has $600 million as a goal over the 2-year budget process. You look at the changes we want to make for health care, allowing local governments, school districts, and others to buy into the state and health plan. That's $300 million right there. There's a systematic series of things, I believe, that we can do in state government that not only will help us balance that $2.7 to over $3 billion budget deficit, but do it in a way that helps us in future budgets not face the same problems.
Let me just jump in, and then we're going to start questions from our audience. Two things about the county budget. One, you did arrange for a loan from the pension fund to help to balance the budget, as I understand it. So that technically would be money that you didn't have.
Actually, I'll stop you right there.
All right.
That's Tom Barrett's commercial, and it's 100% wrong. When I came in, Tom Amick created the unfunded liability in the pension system we face today. That is an unfunded liability that was there before I came in office. What we did through the pension obligation bond program was actually refinance that. If you've got a home, and a lot of people today are refinancing their home, you're taking the lower interest rate, you still have the liability of your home, of the mortgage, you're just using a lower interest rate to do it. That's exactly what we did with our pension reforms. It's not just something I said. The mayor, or the city of Milwaukee, the comptroller for the city of Milwaukee, where Tom Barrett's the mayor is, actually looked at our proposal and said, this was a good idea. He's actually one of the trustees on the Pension Stabilization Fund as a part of that. So we didn't borrow to take care of an unfunded liability. We did just the opposite. We took a better interest rate through bonds to take an unfunded liability we had to pay off over 30 years. We pay it off over 25 years at a lower rate. We actually save the taxpayers long-term $237 million. And in fact, my outstanding debt in the next couple of years is down 30% lower than when I first took office. The city of Milwaukee actually did the opposite. They pushed that off into the future. The mayor talked about making tough decisions. The irony of his commercial is it's completely the opposite. We made the prudent decision, a decision that other governments have made across the country, and in fact, national publications and our bond rating agencies actually pointed to that as one of the strengths of our plan.
Now, the question of employee furloughs with Milwaukee County, some are up to 20 days, so virtually a month, for which they're not being paid, and at the same time that you're talking about the health and welfare of the average family in Milwaukee County. How can a family possibly absorb that kind of a reduction in salary?
Well, you're right. We came in and we proposed very reasonable changes in terms of wage and benefit reform. I'll give you all an example. What we asked for from our employees was a pay freeze. We stopped step increases. We asked for $30 more a month for health care, and a very reasonable plan to begin with. You're an HMO, you're talking about $70 to $100. If you're talking the PPO, it goes from $150 to $180. So for most people outside of government, they'd say that's a pretty reasonable expectation, $30 more per month. And for our pension, we went from a 2.0 multiplier down to 1.6. That's where state workers, by and large, are outside of protectives. Those are things that were reasonable wage and benefit reforms. All my non-union employees started that as of January. We put in place furloughs for those collective bargaining units that did not help us balance the budget, because to me it's only fair. If one group of employees is helping to balance the budget and another group's not, that's where your furlough should be. It shouldn't be in the areas where you're doubling up on people who are already making changes. 3 of our unions stepped forward and said, we're willing to help you out. They voluntarily reached a settlement. A couple of our bigger unions, for political purposes, I would argue, have decided they're not going to do anything until after November. That's where the concentration of those furloughs are at. If we were all able to make those reasonable changes, that would provide about $10.3 million worth of savings. We'd be facing a budget surplus going through the end of the year instead of having to look at furloughs because of that. It's a real simple deal. It's about fairness. If one group of employees is going to help balance the budget, They shouldn't be the ones penalized. The other groups who aren't willing to reach those, what I would argue to be very reasonable expectations, well, that's where the focus is going to be on.
Let me mix in some questions from the audience now. First of all, with regard to the stimulus funds and the high-speed rail project, if in fact you turn back that money or in some way fail or choose not to accept it for this particular project, how does that impact the number of jobs that would be created from that project? Wouldn't you add to the unemployment burden that already exists, particularly with well-paying jobs in the state?
Well, the jobs, there are no jobs created at high-speed rail right now because we don't have it. And if you look at, not my numbers, but the federal government's numbers on the $810 million of taxpayer money that would be spent to build it, and then the $7.5 or more million per year that the state government would have to subsidize on it, for that $810 million, the federal government says that will create 55 permanent jobs. Obviously, all of you can do the math. That's more than $14.5 million per job. I don't think by any measure that's a good use of taxpayers' money. Any of us here could create a whole lot more jobs than one for $14.5 million. Long term, it's a matter of priorities, and I think the high-speed train, or so-called high-speed train, because it's not really high-speed train, that's being proposed by both Governor Doyle and Mayor Barrett as an economic boom, is one where it will create 55 jobs. It will take money away from our roads and our bridges and other transportation needs that we have today. And it's one where I think it's a classic example of runaway government spending. There are needs we have right now in this state that we don't need to have pushed off by taking even more money out of the state transportation fund. Now, there's two options. One is to just send it back, and frankly, for us to do that, to say we'll send the money back instead of being harnessed with a minimum $7.5 million, it's probably closer to $10 million per year when all is said and done. That's money, again, we don't have in the transportation fund. But I don't think that's our only option. If you look back in 1998, Tommy Thompson was faced with a similar circumstance. He had $241 million. Bob, you remember reporting on this. For years, it was that money that was sitting back there from 1991 in the east-west corridor. It was supposed to be, at that time, people were talking about some sort of a light rail system. Tommy Thompson went to the members of Congress from Wisconsin, got them to change it in 1998, and in turn, that freed up that money so a major portion of that could be spent on the Marquette interchange. That saved us hundreds of millions of dollars of state taxpayer money that was able to be spent on that federal state project at the Marquette interchange. I think we can do the same thing. We have needs today, the Home Bridge, I-94, coming up north-south, I-90 through Janesville, up into Madison, up in the Dells. There are plenty of federal interstate projects where we have needs today before we build another system on top of that.
Probably transportation is one of the best indicators of the partisanship that exists with regard to state legislative politics. And we were talking just a little while ago about the state budget and the deficit and how it could be reduced. I think it's fair to agree that any reduction in the budget deficit is going to require some kind of non-partisan action on the part of state lawmakers, yet you as a Republican lawmaker were in most cases voted with the Republican side of the aisle in terms of all budget issues. It's just the way things are done. That's what we're told in Madison. Can we keep doing things that way, that partisan way, and expect to make some of the progress that you've been describing here today?
Well, I think in times of leadership, people need to step up. Clearly, it's an example here in Milwaukee County. I mean, in my case, not only at the ballot box, but in how we govern. There's no way, I mean, there's never been a Republican elected county executive before. Not only have I been elected, but I've been elected now, re-elected two times. The last time was 60% of the vote in the county that went 2/3 for President Obama. So clearly, from a partisan standpoint, there's no reason on paper why you think I could win here. But I think in times of crisis, much as we had 8 years ago when there was the pension crisis, people set aside partisan beliefs and they gravitate towards people who have clear plans and then have the ability to act on those. I think that's what we need right now in state government. It is a time of not only economic crisis, but a budgetary crisis. We need leaders who are willing to step forward to chart out a clear course for the future of the state, and then to be willing to work with anyone. Now, in our case, I would say much more so than the mayor, even the current governor. The governor has problems with his own party. Actually, both do. You saw that in the MPS debate. I mean, an issue that the governor of the state of Wisconsin, the mayor of Milwaukee stuck their necks out. They went to their delegation. They went to the Assembly and the Senate controlled by their own party and couldn't get that through. To me, that certainly questions when there are tough things like the state budget, how they're going to get that through, particularly if it's split or divided. But even if their own party's in charge, if they can't get things through. In contrast, I have a county board that obviously is not empathetic most of the time. I've got 19 members on the county board, 12 are probably self-described liberals, 4 are conservatives, 3 are moderates. Everything I do is a challenge, but instead of going and fighting all the time for the board, what we do more often not to get things passed is we go to the people. We go to the people of our community. It's the same thing we do with the state. We continue to fully engage the people of the state to chart out not only the election, but come January 3rd, the course we'd like to take to get the state's economy going again and to get this budget balanced. I think if you lay that out and you're honest about it and you're straightforward about it and you act on the things you say you're going to do, people will step up and help lead no matter what party they're in.
Let me ask you just briefly about the Milwaukee County budget, because it represents really a wonderful study in civics, I think. You create a budget. It has, in many areas, cuts that are disagreeable to a majority of the board. The board adds funds back in for such things as social service, the bus system, et cetera. You veto the budget. The budget goes back to the county board. Your veto is overridden, and we now have a budget. Who created the budget?
Well, you've got a $1.4 billion budget. The differences between the county board and I are less than 1%. So if you look at the core, even when the county board puts things on that I veto back, and then they override those vetoes, and they don't override every veto. They've overrode some of the vetoes, some they have not. In fact, one year, I didn't veto anything because the second year I was in office, my pledge has always been, if you come back with a budget that doesn't raise the property tax levy, I'm willing to work with the board on exactly how it's aligned. I'm just not willing to pay for the pension excesses of the past by higher property taxes. So that's why my standard was, when I first got in, is I would not raise the property tax levy from the previous year. I said, I'm not going to pay for that. And the standard, people said, well, why do you use that base? I said, the real issue is, it's not just about how far back in time you go. It's for somebody who's living in a home right now where maybe they haven't had a pay raise in years, or where they're retired and they're living on a fixed income. For them, having a 5 or 6 or 7% increase as they've seen in the past in property taxes is just unacceptable, because it gets to the point where they don't know how they're going to live in that home anymore. So my promise was not to propose a tax levy increase from the previous year. I've done that every single year. You're right. In the last couple of years, the board's added some more. I've cut it back. They've overrode some. But you're talking about a few $1 million out of a budget of $1.4 billion. So there are things here or there that are certainly not mine, things that the board has added back in. But the vast majority of things in those budgets are things that both I and the county board signed off.
From the audience, we have a question that reads, you've been endorsed by Pro-Life Wisconsin. Pro-Life Wisconsin has publicly stated they oppose all forms of birth control and want to make birth control illegal. Why do you accept their endorsement, and do you oppose access to birth control as well?
I don't oppose birth control. I'm pro-life. I appreciate the support from a variety of groups. I've had groups all over the spectrum. I even have the Milwaukee Police Association, the Milwaukee Professional Firefighters, 2 unions in this city whose employees work for the mayor of Milwaukee endorse me. Do I support every single issue that every single member of every single group that supported me does? No. I just welcome their support. They know where I stand on the issues. They know, in the case of this, I'm pro-life, and certainly that's a position I take, but I do not oppose birth control. I think that's a decision that people need to make on their own.
From the audience, your website fails to mention only anything about any plans involving veterans. With the recent redeployment of the 32nd Infantry Brigade, how do you plan on helping this all-inclusive minority?
Yeah, and actually it's an increasingly large number of folks. And again, one of those where I think it's a contrast. This current governor, unfortunately, has made the State Veterans Board highly politicized. It's a group where the appointments he made to that board actually ended up firing the Secretary of Veterans Affairs, someone who was supported by the overwhelming majority of veterans groups in the state, after he came back from his second deployment overseas as a part of the ongoing operations in Iraq and Afghanistan. I think that's deplorable. What I've shown at the county is we made support for veterans an issue that's not ideological, that's not political, that's one just about supporting the men and women who have served and continue to serve and their families. And the classic examples of that, we moved our County Veterans Service Office from a dark corner in the basement of the county courthouse where it wasn't very accessible, out to a spot on the VA grounds where we were closer to not only more routes and easier access on and off the freeway, but to where a lot of our veterans go at the Zablocki Center to receive health care. That has seen a tremendous growth in the number of veterans that have come in, not only from Milwaukee County, but many of them come in from surrounding areas across this region, which is fine with us. We plug them into the benefits they deserve and should expect from both the federal and the state government. We've done that very aggressively at the county level. As governor, I'd continue to do that, certainly everything from continuing to support tuition breaks in terms of the ongoing process that was supported with bipartisan support of making sure that our veterans, particularly those coming back, have access to the University of Wisconsin system. I want to make sure we continue to plug them into the benefits not only the state has, but that the federal government has. I want to make sure in many ways we're helping them plug them into assistance in ways that paths that get them into employment if they seek to find new paths towards employment once they return from deployment. Overall, we're going to embrace a system that continues to not just maintain the status quo, but find ever-increasing ways to support our veterans here in the state of Wisconsin.
Yesterday, we heard Tom Barrett say that if he is governor, he might allow concealed carry to retired police officers or people with a military history. First, what do you think about firearms? Second, how is your position different from your challengers?
I would support a legal right to carry in this state. Governor Doyle's vetoed that passed. It's a measure. The measure he vetoed is almost identical to what other states, for example, our neighbors in Minnesota have had for years. They've had no problems with that. It's something that I have every reason to believe that we can do successfully here in the state of Wisconsin. It's something that even the police chief here in the city of Milwaukee has said is a reasonable thing to do. As governor, I would sign concealed carry, not just for a limited few. I would make it legal to anyone who is legal to have a firearm.
Let me ask you a question briefly about strategizing in this election. And I'm wondering specifically about the importance of Brown County and, for that matter, the Fox River Valley of Wisconsin, including Outagamie and Waupaca and Winnebago County. How important is that population area of the state going to be to the success of you or Barrett when it comes to winning this election? In fact, might that be the most important geographic area up for grabs currently?
Well, clearly it's a swing area that's gone back and forth the last couple elections. I've been up in Brown County, for example, 5 times in the last week, so that my schedule probably indicates that that's a pretty important area. But having said that, we were laughing on the way up. I told somebody coming up with me that I've been to Superior 6 times in this election, more than any candidate, at least according to the newspaper up there, more than any candidate who's run for governor in the past. What I mean by that is, heck, I've been in Dane County 5 times in the last week. I'm not conceding any votes anywhere. Just because one part of the state is deemed as important, certainly there are key places in terms of swing areas, but we've got 20 campuses here and across the state of Wisconsin. We've got 20 college campuses organized. You know, the mayor said last Wednesday, made another, I think, erroneous claim that somehow we weren't caring about college campuses and college students' votes. That's just plain wrong. We have 20 campuses organized. We're going to fight for votes in every part of the state of Wisconsin. When I come to college campuses, I said, well, you know, tuition is something I certainly care about, having 2 kids that are about to go off to college myself, and financial aid and all those other issues. The number one issue on college campuses should be who's more likely to have created an environment where when I graduate there's a job out there. Because that's really ultimately what matters the most when you think ahead to the future, and that's one of the contrasts out there. But in terms of strategy, we're not conceding any vote in the state of Wisconsin. I'm more than willing to tackle the challenges in any part of the state of Wisconsin, because if God willing, with the help of the voters, I'm elected governor, I'm not going to be the governor of one part of the state versus another. I'm going to be the governor of the state of Wisconsin. And that means whether you vote for me or not, I'm still going to be acting to look out for your best interest if I have the honor of serving as your governor.
There is a historic distrust of Milwaukee by many state lawmakers from so-called out-state areas. I'm wondering, what is it that you found those voters, that is to say those that are not necessarily even in urban centers in this state, are interested in? Have you heard certain themes repetitively as you've traveled around the state?
Well, certainly the further you get away from southeastern Wisconsin, part of the challenge is that many voters across the state, no matter what party they typically vote with, assume that the power center is Milwaukee and Madison, and that elected officials in the Capitol only care about those 2 major corridors. You know, I'm proud to be the Milwaukee County Executive. I'm proud, as you mentioned, to live in Wauwatosa with my wife Tonette and our 2 sons. But I grew up in a small town down in Walworth County. I grew up in Delavan. And, you know, so in many ways I feel like I can relate on multiple levels. I live in the largest county in the state, but I grew up in a smaller area and a relatively rural area as well. And I think, you know, the distrust is sometimes overrated by the media, in that the distrust isn't about people from Milwaukee. It's about politicians for Milwaukee. And what I mean by that is for years, they've seen politicians in Milwaukee asking for more money, for more programs without any accountability. And so there's this feeling, sometimes exaggerated, but sometimes accurately, that the dollars that come in the state government are being sent to places like Milwaukee without any true accountability for how those funds are being spent, and they feel that then takes away from other parts of the state. So part of it's getting to that, but it's not an anti-Milwaukee. It's an anti-Milwaukee politician, because there's still plenty of people who love to come to Summerfest, who talk about going to the state fair, love to come down to a Brewers games. There's plenty of things that people all across the state like about this part of the state. It's just the disconnect with so many of the politicians they've seen in the past are people who they feel aren't looking out for the interest of the state as a whole. So part of it is presence. It's why, for example, I've been up to Superior 6 times. It's why you go to other parts of the state frequently, is for people to understand that we know that one part of the state isn't the same as the other. You know, when the mayor got into the race last November, he came out of his house in Milwaukee and announced he was in, then went back in the house. The media asked me to respond to that, and they said, oh, can we interview at your house? And I said, well, no, I'm actually up at Green Bay. See, Tonette and the boys and I were up at a tailgate before the Cowboys-Packers game, and so I said I'd be glad to talk to you, but I went out over in front of the atrium, in fact, right in front of where Curly Lambeau and Vince Lombardi's statues are, and talked to the press, you know, with a Packers turtleneck on and jersey and the whole bit. And at the end, one of the reporters said to me, well, the Barrett campaign says they haven't been running for the past year like you are. That makes them different. And I said, I'm not going to apologize for having traveled the state. What I've found now for more than a year and a half is that people want to know that you know about them, that you care about them, not just when it's election time. People want to know that you don't just show up for 15 minutes on a bus tour going around the state, that you actually understand that one part of the state is different than the other. When I go to Superior, it's more than just a campaign stop. I've been there enough times that I know that Murphy Oil is one of the biggest employers in northwestern Wisconsin. I know when we talk about shipping issues that the Port of Superior has about a $300 million impact on that part of the state's economy. And I know that changes that are done there, if they're done negatively, just push that commerce across the bay over to Duluth, and that's the economic benefit of people from Minnesota, not just from Wisconsin. Superior. Now, Superior is just one example of many. When I go to La Crosse, I understand that Quick Trip isn't just a convenience store that you buy gas and food at, but it's actually employs 1,000 people in the Cooley region, because I've toured their facility and their warehouse, and I've seen their bakery. I even see where the 39-cent bananas come from and everything else in between. Those are things you get when you go around the state and you actually spend time not just showing up for the cameras, but actually understanding what makes those areas tick, what helps the economy in those areas, what are the core issues in those areas. Those are things you get by being out on the campaign trail and doing more than just showing up for a press conference, but actually understanding people. When I go around the state and talk to folks, the one thing that's universal is that people are scared. I mean, a lot of times I'll go to diners or other places where people eat, and I always laugh. I say, people tell you anything when they're eating. They'll just talk freely at breakfast. They'll sit down and tell you about things. And from one part of the state to the other, it may be for different specifics, but basically people are scared. They're scared about the economy. They're scared about losing their own job or their spouse's job or the kid's job, or if they're a small business owner. Many of them are just frightened to death that they're going to have to lay off some employees, because for them, you know, if you've got 5, 10 employees, it's almost like it's your family. They're just plain scared about the economy. And so the things we talk about are things that are going to not just help them not be afraid, but ultimately things that can help, particularly our small businesses, get this day going again. It's why on Monday when I was in Green Bay, we laid out a specific course of not just our broader plan to create 250,000 new jobs by the end of our term, but really something to kickstart that. And I said specifically, I will start the first day I'm in office. I will declare an economic emergency in this state, and then declare a special session of the legislature, not for some point in the future, but starting right away on January 3rd, where we'll target jobs, and specifically jobs through small businesses. We'll cut taxes on businesses that are 50 employees or less, cut back the tax on employers there, because right now, anywhere from 2/3 to 80% of the jobs that are going to be created come from small businesses. They need more money to put in capital. They need more money to hire employees. That's something that we have to do now. We talk about changes in terms of healthcare costs and doing something as simple in that first special session, repealing the state tax on health savings accounts, something that all but 4 states in this country have done, Democrat or Republican governors alike. Things like pulling back on the high regulatory burden on our small business and the litigation burden. Those are all things we can do right away, right when we come into office.
From the audience, there have been several serious problems at the County House of Corrections and the County Mental Health Complex. Budget cuts for maintenance led to a tragedy at the lakefront. Can you explain why we should not hold you accountable for these conditions?
Sure. Well, and again, the last statement is just completely erroneous, 100% wrong. The problems which an outside, independent, out-of-state engineering firm came in about O'Donnell Park showed that the failures of not only the panel that came down, but the other panels there go all the way back to the installation, all the way back to the 1990s. In the 1990s, I was still only a couple years older than many of the students here today, so clearly I didn't have anything directly to do with that. If you look at the inspections, the same firms came through and said those panels were installed incorrectly. They were not installed the way they were designed to. That's what caused the failure, again, that they're worried about many of the other existing panels that are up there. Those are things they also noted that because they were, the installation was done in a way that no one at the time from the county or anyone since then would know was installed correctly. There's no inspection that would have been done under any normal circumstances for anybody, be it a public, a private, some other level of government, that would have identified that. What we had to do is actually send in equipment that deals with sonar. We had to peel away the caulking and actually use video scopes to determine how the rest of the panels were installed. That's something that we're committed to fixing. But I think anyone who objectively has looked at that, and quite frankly, that line of questioning, I think was revealed on Sunday when Dan Bice ran a story in the Journal Sentinel pointing out that precisely the groups that SEIU and some of the other very liberal unions that want to see me defeated have been coordinating, have been collaborating. I would argue potentially even illegally collaborating between themselves, the state Democrat Party, and even conversations they've had with Mayor Tom Barrett's campaign, all of which, if it's accurate, and this gentleman hasn't yet to deny what he said was not accurate, would not only be unethical, in many cases it would be illegal. I think that is part of a concerted effort to try and blame things that people don't care whether or not it's true or not. In this case, the evidence is overwhelming that it wasn't true. In other cases, challenges to the mental health complex, we absolutely take accountability for it. In the end, even if I don't directly run those programs, if it's something that ultimately falls under the county, we take accountability for it. We've taken action on it. We've eliminated one of the psychiatrists that was there no longer works for the county at all. We've changed the person who's the administrator of that function. My budget, I've already announced about $5.5 million worth of improvements. But part of our challenge has been, this year alone, we're facing about $3.6 million in reductions from the state government. So we constantly have had to make up for the fact that over, not just this year, over the years, the state's pulled back on their commitment to serving those with mental illness. We continue to have to add more to that. We're going to do it again. Same thing was true with the House of Corrections. We stood forward several years ago and said, we're going to fix this. I worked with the sheriff, and right now, we're completely on top of that. That's a stark contrast, though, when you talk about holding people accountable. That is a stark contrast between me and the mayor. The mayor of Milwaukee, when he ran for mayor, said, amongst other things, he had this big plan, like he's talking about a big plan for the state now. He specifically talked about how he was going to fix a number of things, 2 of which are important to know. One was MPS. He had a plan to take over MPS. He got a little pushback on that. He pulled back on that, and for 6 years he sat silent. It wasn't until the governor of the state of Wisconsin, for fiscal reasons, came back to him that he started talking about that issue again. But for 6 years, he sat silent on that issue. Equally as important, when he ran for mayor, he blamed Marvin Pratt for the problems with the sewage district. The mayor doesn't directly run the sewage district, but the mayor of Milwaukee, any mayor, appoints 7 of the 11 commissioners to the board of, or to the commissioners who run the Milwaukee Metropolitan Sewage District. He said at the time that Marvin Pratt was responsible for the failures with the sewage system, of the sewage going into our lake and other waterways. And he specifically said in his proposal for running for mayor that if, as mayor, he would stop the release of raw sewage into our lakes. Well, since then, we've had more than 8 billion gallons of sewage go into Lake Michigan and our waterways throughout this year. To me, that's a difference. We're not to say that we're perfect. I don't think there's any government in the state or in this country who can point to saying they're perfect. But in the times when we've had challenges, We've tackled them. The buck stops with me. We make changes. We improve them. We move forward. Years ago, there used to be problems that both the city and the county had with supportive housing for people with mental illness. We took that challenge, and just yesterday, I helped break ground for yet another supportive housing unit where the city and the county, the state and the federal government, along with private investors, work together to create more supportive housing. When we face challenges, we take them head on and deal with them. The mayor, in 2 of those examples I give, has pushed the ball off to somebody else and now is blaming anybody but himself, even though he made those promises when he ran for mayor.
One of the shining stars of county government is Milwaukee County, or I should say Milwaukee's Mitchell International Airport. It is a Milwaukee County facility. In fact, it stands on its own. It's not a tax-supported system as such. It's paid for through fees. You've proposed privatizing it on at least a couple of occasions. Do you still see that as a wise course to follow?
Sure. If you look actually for helping out other areas in county government, particularly our transit system, which needs a long-term funding source to continue to make it stable. Some have proposed a higher sales tax. I don't think in this climate, asking people to pay higher taxes, no matter what it's for, is a good use. In fact, if we were to add to the sales tax, that would push more people to surrounding counties. We're seeing in Waukesha counties don't even have sales taxes to begin with. We'd become a tax island. That would just push commerce and business and jobs to other places further beyond. In the case of the county's airport, I'm proud to say that since I've been in office, we've invested $199 million in infrastructure improvements in our airport. It's something where the county board and I have worked together on that. It's a good example where on many key issues we actually do work together, despite what some in other outlets in the media suggest. In this case, we've made prudent investments. In doing so, our staff, which we've empowered there, has not only made those improvements, but we actually attracted more airlines in. Last November, we brought Southwest Airlines in. Over the past couple of years, we've not only brought AirTran in, AirTran has one of their only 2 other hubs in the country is right here in Milwaukee. We brought Republic in with Frontier, or to bring them back to where Midwest was once at. We brought United or Delta, and others in. We have helped, through our improvements, see Milwaukee become literally the fastest growing airport in the country. And as of right now, the 4th fastest growing airport in the world. And because of that, we've helped attract nearly 1,000 new private sector jobs. That's something we're proud of, and we've done and we showed that good prudent investments. In terms of bidding that out for long-term lease, much like we already do at the airport anyway for concessions and other things, something that they're looking to do with Midway in Chicago and other places, that's something that funding stream could help the county ultimately offset the cost of the bus transit system, which would be a win-win for everybody.
Although Midway in Chicago was suggested but rejected, as I understand it.
Well, they ended up doing it because at the height of that, it was right at the time when the market changed. They've come back and are trying it again, much like Mayor Daley did years ago for Skyway successfully. Got over $1 billion for the Skyway toll bridge. Money, again, they plugged into improvements in their infrastructure.
From the audience, the UW system has proposed increasing its budget so it can produce more college graduates. Do you support the system's growth agenda initiative?
Well, I think overall we need to find better ways to enable each of our individual campuses to attract more students and ultimately graduate more students out of the University of Wisconsin. I look at it, though, more on a campus-by-campus basis. I think when you look at specifics, you think about in the Milwaukee 7 region here in southeastern Wisconsin, UWM, UW Parkside, UW Whitewater, as well as other colleges like Marquette and others down the line, are key parts of the economic engine that drive regional economic development in the 7 counties in southeastern Wisconsin. You go to the new north and northeastern Wisconsin, UW, Green Bay, and St. Norbert's and other institutions like that are a key part of it. We need to not only empower our campuses to see fit to bring through more graduates, we need to make sure we empower them on a campus-by-campus basis so those resources can be tied into not just what the UW system wants, but more specifically into what the economic needs of those given regions are.
When asked about what he appreciated about you yesterday, Tom Barrett said he's from Wisconsin. So we want to ask the same question. What do you appreciate about your opponent?
Oh, he's a nice guy. Tom and I have gotten along on many issues in the past. And one I mentioned just a few minutes ago was supportive housing for people suffering from mental illness. And when those stories came out years ago, it would have been real easy for the county to point a finger at the city and say, the city does public housing. Vice versa, the city could have pointed to the county and said the county does supportive services. Instead, in that case, the mayor and I got together and said, we're not going to point fingers. We're just going to get the job done.
I want to just go back to the budget, the state budget for just a moment.
Although the interesting thing I should say is, for years I've known Tom to be a nice guy. After I heard what he said yesterday, it seems like he's kind of gone in this campaign from Mr. Nice to Mr. Nasty. Because as I understand, almost every response was yes for 1 second, and then he spent the rest of the time telling you what was bad about me. I want to tell people what's great about Wisconsin, how we're going to get it working again.
From the audience, the question is, do you plan to use furloughs of state employees as part of your state budget process? And let me just kind of cover that with perhaps a larger question, and that is something that Rob Henkin with the Public Policy Forum here in Milwaukee, and you know, of course, from your days when he was with the county, has recommended, I think that's a fair verb, that the whole tax and revenue structure of the state of Wisconsin really ought to be reviewed. Are we doing the best we can in creating revenue for the state through the existing tax structure as it exists? So that's kind of the macro. The micro is, will you use furloughs, which of course are already in place, but expand furloughs as part of state budget?
Well, certainly furloughs should be a kind of a last resort type thing when other things aren't working as well as like it. And it's why the furloughs we're doing at the county are really a reflection of the fact that certain of our collective bargaining unions haven't stepped up and helped us balance the budget like other parts of the other employees have throughout the county government. It also should be one where you don't use it as a tool for punishing. I mean, for us, it's really about balancing the budget. It's not because we're trying to in any way inflict pain on employees at any level at the county or otherwise. At the state, unfortunately, I think under Governor Doyle, that policy hasn't been the case. If you look at the furloughs he's enacted, they've been across the board. That means in corrections, they furlough correctional officers just like anybody else, and to replace them, because in a 24/7 post, you can't leave that vacant, they've actually had to put people time and a half in. So it's actually cost the state more to make sure they apply those furloughs across the board. As county executive, I haven't done that. I haven't furloughed correctional officers. I haven't recommended furloughing law enforcement in terms of sheriff's deputies, because one, public safety is a priority, but two, you have to fill those posts anyway, so you're cutting off your nose to spite yourself. The governor furloughed positions like that. The mayor's furloughed police officers. In both cases, I think that's a wrong strategy. In addition, and right here at campuses like this, it's another example, there are furloughs done of positions that aren't GPR, general purpose revenue. There are furlough of positions that have to do with grants, either from the federal government or from private grants. Well, that's money that doesn't save anything from the state budget, and yet it's being done universally. To me, that's money you're sending back to the institution that gave that grant. That doesn't make any sense. You got to be prudent about that. Again, you should use that as the last source of balancing a budget. And you're going to see next Thursday, our budget for the county does not depend on furloughs as the primary step. It's only as a fallback if some of the other wage and benefit reforms we push ultimately aren't fulfilled. Those are the same things we're going to look at the state.
Yeah, just briefly, do we need a comprehensive look at how revenue is generated and how the tax structure is set up?
Well, I think the biggest problem we have in government isn't that we don't have enough revenue, it's that we spend too much. And we don't spend it wisely, or that government doesn't spend it wisely. I think if you ask the average small business owner, the average taxpayer out there, they wouldn't tell you that they don't think government taxes enough. They'd tell you they don't believe, and I think they're accurate, that government at the state and at other levels spends the money it has effectively enough. It's why when I talk about not just the state budget, when I talk about local governments, school districts, towns, cities, counties, villages, I not only talk about balancing our budget, I talk about giving local governments more tools to balance their budgets as well, because we're not going to have more money to give the local government, so the money we do have has to be spent more effectively. A couple examples. You know, with school districts, the wage and benefit reforms that were once in there, this governor repealed. That means the money they get from the state, from the taxpayer, the local property taxpayer, more and more of it goes into compensation and less into the classroom. I'd like to see more go in the classroom. I'd like to change the arbitration process so that it includes variables that aren't just other public entities, but the private sector as well. I'd like to put a moratorium on all state mandates and then peel back the unfunded or underfunded state mandates that are already there. I'd like to allow local governments, school districts, and other local governments buy into the state employee health care plan. That alone would save school districts $68 million and overall local governments about $300 million. Those are all things we can do that not only help us at the state level, but empower local officials to more effectively spend the dollars they do have.
We have time for one more question. Okay. It is from the audience. In January, for the first time, Wisconsin domestic partner benefits were awarded to state employees. Do you support this right, and would you work to make sure that it is sustained?
No, I don't, and as county executive, I actually vetoed a resolution that would have taken us down the same path at the county. I think the last thing we need are more benefits for state employees right now. State employees already get many more and much higher levels of benefits than the private sector, and the taxpayers can't afford to add any more.
We have just a minute left, and you're our invited guest here today, so I want to make sure that we allow a little bit of time for you to make a closing statement or a summary of your choice.
Well, thanks, and Bob, thanks. You went through rapid fire there, so hopefully we got to at least the majority of questions that people had out there. For me, it's an honor, essentially not just to run, but to apply to be your next governor. That's really what this process is all about. It's why I crisscrossed the state to talk about the ideas that we have and to listen to the concerns that people have. You know, in the end, we took on a very similar challenge 8 years ago here in Milwaukee County, where the government was out of control, the budget was out of control, taxes were out of control, and a lot of people I served with at that time told me it was unwise for me to run for office because it would be a political dead end. And I said it just didn't matter to me because in the end, not only for me, but for my sons, Matt and Alex, for Tonette and our sons, Matt and Alex, I wanted to make sure that they continued to have a great place to live in, to grow up in, and to ultimately raise their own families and work in. And I took on that challenge, and I think, while not everything's perfect, we've done much, much better than people thought. We've done exceptionally well in keeping the promises we said we'd do in terms of taxes, in terms of spending, in terms of making this a better environment to live in. And as governor, I don't think there's anybody else out there who faced a more similar challenge to what the next governor will face as to what I faced 8 years ago here in Milwaukee County. We took on that challenge. We did it successfully. If you give me the chance to be your next governor, that's exactly what I'm going to do starting January 3rd.
Thank you, Scott Walker.
Great. Good to be here.
I'd like to say thank you for all of the audience members that are here today. Thank you for coming and listening, and also for those who were generous enough to send up a question. I'm sorry that we couldn't get to all of them. The ones that we did read I thought were particularly well written. Thank you very much for doing that. Thanks to UWM for sponsoring this forum. And again, you'll have an opportunity to hear a rebroadcast of today's event on WUWM's Lake Effect program starting at 10. It's also been recorded by Wisconsin Eye. Thanks to UWM and to WisPolitics.com. Thank you all.